Okay, we're back. Let's finish up the chapter 1. So let's get started. American political ideology, and we'll take a look at that. Conservatism and liberalism. The traditional political spectrum and beyond conservatism and liberalism. Okay, what is an ideology? It's on page bottom of page 12. If you have the edition, if you have edition 10, it should be around that area, but it's under learning objective 1-4. So what is an ideology? It's a system of political ideas, and many of you expressed them in your introductions. What you believe. A lot of you talked about, well, I believe everybody should be treated fairly, regardless of race and creed and religion. And some of you believe that there's been this, there's been that, so that you have these certain philosophical beliefs concerning human nature. Some of you believe that some people are bad, but some people are good. Some of you believe all people are bad. And some of you believe that all people are good. That's part of an ideology, really. And some of you believed, what society is like. Some of you talked about what you thought about society in general and what you thought about government. Some of you blamed the government for this and said the government's not doing enough of that. And these are all part of your political ideology. So you do have one. You really didn't know that, but and some of you told me where you got it. You said, well, I think some of you said, well, I got it from my parents, this belief, that belief, this person was more influential. But these are people that are going to have an influence in your lives. We'll see that in chapter 8, that family is the most important. So oftentimes your political ideology is shaped by your family, the people that are around you, your siblings as you get older. But broadly, over the expanse of this country, there's 2 basic types of political ideologies: conservatives and liberals. That's the term used to describe the individual with the ideology, but conservatism is the ideology. Liberal is the ideology. Conservatives are the people that believe in conservatism. Liberals are the people that believe or ascribe or like the idea of liberalism. So let's look at it from a different point of view with a video from Prager University, which is very helpful on, are you an ideologue? Do you have an ideology? Are you a pragmatist? And the gentleman will explain what that is.
One of the staple arguments of American liberals, from Presidents Woodrow Wilson to Bill Clinton, from education reformer John Dewey to New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, is that they don't believe in labels. Liberals are pragmatists and realists and empiricists. They only care about what works. Conservatives, meanwhile, are ideologues or extremists or dogmatists or just plain lunatics who are blinded by ideology. Here's what President Barack Obama said on the subject. What is required is a new Declaration of Independence, not just in our nation, but in our own lives, from ideology and small thinking, prejudice and bigotry. Did you catch that? If you have an ideology, you belong amongst the bigots and the mentally confused. Once you start paying attention, you'll hear variations on this claim all over the place. In truth, it is a very old technique, pioneered by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, who sought to demonize his critics as mesmerized theorists enthralled to an ideology, while he put the needs of the nation above all considerations. Marx picked up the technique, arguing that only the people who agreed with him were free of mind-warping ideology. The desirability and inevitability of socialism was to them a scientific fact, and therefore anyone who disagrees with scientific fact must be, in effect, brainwashed. In the 20th century, the American progressives offered their own version of the same idea. They created a whole philosophical school, pragmatism, which as a matter of principle rejected philosophical principles. William James, the most important founder of pragmatism, argued that we should measure ideas not by whether they're right or wrong, but by whether they work. Ideas are right if they have cash value, according to James. Herbert Croly, the founder of the New Republic, responding to the criticism that his liberal magazine was too pro-Mussolini, whose ideas seemed to be working in Italy at the time, said it well. If there are any abstract liberal principles, we do not know how to formulate them. Nor, if they are formulated by others, do we recognize their authority. Liberalism, as we understand it, is an activity. Contemporary American liberalism has inherited this pose. It is certain it knows what works. Liberalism. And what is liberalism? What liberals do. It's an activity. And they denigrate opposing viewpoints not as competing ideas or positions, but as the products of a warped ideological worldview. How often do you hear people say, I don't believe in labels? Whether it's liberal politicians, TV news anchors, columnists, cable news hosts, or your brother-in-law, Harry, the line always goes something like this. Why can't we move beyond these partisan labels? Why can't we get beyond this philosophical divide and get to the hard work of dealing with the problems facing the American people? Warning, people only say these things when they want you to shut up and get with their program. What you never hear them say is, we need to move beyond these partisan labels. We need to get beyond the philosophical divide. And for that reason, I'm going to abandon all of my principles and agree with you. Look, I'm not saying that liberal ideological positions are wrong. That's another discussion. My point is that liberals are wrong when they say they don't have ideological principles in the first place. Moreover, there's nothing wrong with having ideological principles. To say that you have ideological principles isn't really all that different from saying that you simply have principles. Like with anything else, there are good ideologies and bad ideologies, good ideas, bad ideas. Think of ideology as a checklist of your priorities, your first principles. Do you consider economic freedom important or trivial? Is the right to life fundamental or frivolous? Is private property a more valuable principle than economic redistribution? These are all ideological questions, and asking them doesn't make you closed-minded, it makes you more serious-minded. There is no unideological answer to these questions. On abortion, for example, if you come down on the pro-life side, you're being ideological. And if you come down on the pro-choice side, you're still being ideological. The difference is that people who take their principles seriously understand that they have principles. And when they string them together, they have an ideology. It is the people who constantly reject rigorous thinking because they are afraid to be led beyond their easy instincts who are closed-minded. The fear of hypocrisy, of judging people, of making hard choices on principle. This is the fear of ideology that causes people to retreat into relativism or nihilism, or what we might here call no-labelism. As G.K. Chesterton wrote, trees have no dogmas and turnips are singularly broad-minded. In terms of ideology, serious people should aspire to be more than a tree or a turnip. I'm Jonah Goldberg for Prager University.
Okay, so that's a good overview of what an ideology is, I think. Just a set of philosophical beliefs, political ideas that you have, and you all have them, every single one of you, even Mr. Turner. Okay, well, let's move on then to the first one that's discussed in your book. That's called conservatism. Pardon me. Conservatives believe in conservatism, which is a set of political beliefs that include a limited role, a smaller role of national government in helping individuals and in national economic affairs. And that's what Trump and the Republicans typically believe, although you've seen a lot of expansive role of the federal government with the money coming down during the pandemic and so on. That's a more larger role that typically is the Democrats, the liberals. But during other economic times, usually what the national government's role is for the conservatives is a limited role, a smaller government role. Now, they believe also in traditional values and lifestyles. So, no homosexuality, um, a mother, father run household, married, and bringing up children. Now, the modern conservatives came about because of men like, these are mentioned in your book, like Barry Goldwater, who won the Republican um, nomination back in 1964 and ran against LBJ but lost, and Ronald Reagan pictured there on the right. Now, let me show you a video on them, on Goldwater, who talks about what is the view of conservatives versus liberals. Let's take a look at that. He debates McGovern, who ran for president in 1972 and lost for the Democrats.
Senator Goldwater, what does liberal mean now in American politics?
Well, liberal to me means a person who is willing to keep on trying political answers that have never worked in the past, like socialism, like the federal control, things like that.
This is a
Agree with
conservative
that
point of
definition,
view.
Senator
No,
McGovern?
you wouldn't expect me to
No.
accept
Now,
that.
this would be a liberal.
Liberalism is an innovative, experimental approach to government. It's also a humane and somewhat generous approach to government. It's deeply concerned about people that aren't as fortunate as Barry Goldwater and I have been.
Would you say that the key difference between a liberal and a conservative has to do with the way people view the role of government?
I think that's probably right. For most of the time, at least since World War II, we've had a more or less bipartisan foreign policy. So liberalism versus conservatism doesn't have an awful lot to do with foreign policy or national defense. What it has to do with is the role of government in meeting people's problems, particularly people who are somewhat handicapped, children, for example, who aren't in a position to meet all their own needs, dependent women, the poor, the handicapped, the sick, the homeless. To me, liberalism does a better job of reaching out to people like that. It doesn't mean that they're against the middle class or against the upper class. In fact, I think those classes do very well when liberals are in power.
Senator Goldwater, what do you think of Senator McGovern's definition?
Well, I would agree with it, but I just offer as an example of what can happen. Look at the farmers where my friend lives, and from federal control of 30% of the farmers has practically destituted the farmers of this country. Those people, those farmers who did not come under federal control have been doing very well. So I go back to the old idea, the conservative doesn't want to try the failures of the past. We want to make our progress on what we know has worked in the past, but we'll try anything new.
But what about his point about humanity, that there is a element of humanity that goes with liberalism that is not there with conservatives?
Oh, I disagree with that completely. The Republican Party way back in the days of Lincoln recognized that if the people could not take care of each other, the state or the county could not take care of each other, then it became the duty of the federal government to take care of those people who could not well take care of themselves nor take care at all. But the expanded role that the liberal government has gotten into, frankly, is the big factor of our being so much in debt.
If I could just pick
Sure.
up on what Barry Goldwater said about the farm issue. He makes a good conservative argument against any kind of federal intervention on agriculture. But the fact is, these farmers, particularly the family farmer, the guy that depends on his own labor to make a living on the land, most of them can't make it without some kind of government program to stabilize farm prices.
In this particular election, Senator Goldwater, there's been the suggestion, around the edges at least, that to be a liberal is to be somehow a less patriotic American than a conservative. Is that true in your opinion?
It's not true in my opinion. Now let's look at these two gentlemen running for president. George Dukakis is a true American. He's a loyal American. He's worked hard. He's been a governor. George Bush has worked hard. He's a vice president. He's been head of a number of organizations in this country. I think they're both honorable, patriotic, dedicated Americans. And I don't like this idea that's starting to creep around both camps that the other fellow's no damn good because he doesn't agree 100% over here or 100% over here. Let's have him admit that this thing is a race for the presidency of the United States. It's not a race for the most popular man. It's the man that's going to do this country the most good.
Okay, so let's stop there. There's a lot more to this interview, but this was a conservative discussing things, elements of what liberals believe. So that'll be a good segue into that. Let's move on then to the a little bit further into this conservative thinking. Conservatives, they believe that if you do distribute economic benefits, social benefits like welfare and all those kind of things, they don't want to do it too much. They want to take a little approach, and they feel that individuals, families should take care of their own, and states and local governments should take care of it first, try to. And they place a high value on order. So a lot of, and you can see this reflected in most Americans actually are conservative, and polls are showing that they're being really pushed to respond to the polling, the people that ask questions of Americans to answer that we've got to bring these cities under control, like Portland and Chicago and Kenosha, Wisconsin, and other cities where they've been having rioting, Antifa, BLM, and a lot of shootings. So 60 to 75% of Americans believe we've got to have order. We got to bring order to these cities. So there's a high value on order among Americans, and it's given a little higher value among conservatives, if I can use that. It's not to say liberals don't believe in law and order as well, but conservatives really stress it. In fact, in one poll recently, I think yesterday, public order came out number one concern of 60 to 70% of Americans. And this is going to impact elections for office like president. Now, there are other conservatives that will emphasize different aspects of their political ideological beliefs in conservatism. Some are social conservatives, as you can see on my chart. They believe that, again, life is precious from conception to birth and so on. And their traditional marriage, God and society. This emerged in the 80s, this idea with the Christian Coalition and so on. And there are defense hawks. These are sometimes you'll hear the term neoconservatives. Many of them have left and supported Joe Biden. They felt that, and this is kind of, in a one way, remarkable because being Trump is very pro-Israel, the neocons have left his camp because they were pro-Israel, but they're going to go with Joe Biden. And even though Mr. Trump believes in a powerful military, strong defense, again, they're going the other way. I think it's because his foreign policy, some would say he doesn't have one, but some would say it is different. Take troops out of Germany, they've been there for 70 years, post-World War II period, and put them in Poland, take them back to the States, get out of all these endless wars as Trump campaigned on in 2016 and this year. So these are ideas, though, that some of these defense hawks don't agree with. Let's stay in Syria. Let's have some presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a lot of people have decided to leave the conservatism, but mainly just the Republican Party for this election because of they just dislike Trump, I think, personally. I think that's a large part of it. Anyway, fiscal conservatives emphasize the spending part. we're accumulating all this debt, and that was mentioned in the video with Goldwater. Okay, as I mentioned, most states, most of the voters are conservative or very conservative, and this chart shows you that. The brown states like Texas are very conservative. You know, once you go north of the checkpoint, you're in very conservative land, really. And Oklahoma, Mississippi, South Carolina, Indiana, these are very conservative states. And they'll vote. The only one that I would doubt would be maybe Arizona because of the recent influx of California people. They might tip to the liberal camp and vote for Joe Biden, or might be more moderate, I would say. Might be more blue right now. But the rest of these states are still what I would call conservative or very conservative. Now, the ones that are moderate, you can see in blue, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, Georgia, Kansas. Those will probably vote for Trump, and they're conservative to moderate, but they put them as moderate. I would agree with that. Sometimes they go blue, Democrat, sometimes they go Republican. Most of them have gone Republican this last election for president. Although Washington, Oregon, they'll vote for Joe Biden this year. The rest of those blue states might, except for Colorado, might vote for, I think will vote for Trump. Now, the red states are liberal. However, Michigan is an interesting one because of the auto industry, manufacturing industries coming back to Michigan because of Trump's, frankly, trade policies. Like it or not, that helped him in the campaign of 2016. And he's up by 2 points in Michigan as of yesterday in the polls. So there's a good chance he might take Michigan. And even the Senate race is close between a Republican and a Democrat. New York, because of New York City, a very liberal city, will probably stay liberal. West Virginia is also interesting. It's going to vote for Trump, even though it's liberal on this map. Virginia will vote for, I should have said this, Virginia will vote for Joe Biden, and mainly because of the Washington, D.C. area, which extends out into Virginia. You have a lot of people that work in government, and so they want an expansive government, and so that would be a more liberal point of view, which brings us to the liberal point of view, which is a more active government viewpoint, that government can be expansive, it can advocate, intervene, improve the economy, common welfare, protect civil rights, that kind of stuff. And the roots can be traced into the New Deal programs of FDR, and it favors the separation of church and state. The New Deal expanded greatly under the Great Society programs of this president. Of course, that's Lyndon Johnson here where my cursor is. Today, we have political beliefs that are alternatives to liberalism, like progressives. Now, the term dates to the early 20th century when you had presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, who felt that government should step in and regulate industries. And Taft, his successor, believed some of that as well, a Republican progressive to some extent. But then Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, came back. Now, he had more traditional views of race relations, although he was okay with using government in other areas to reform certain things. They reformed the tax code, the election of U.S. senators, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. So it was active, this reform movement in both major political parties. And so some today use that term. Now, the true political spectrum, going back to that video you saw at the beginning of class about the amount of government power can be laid at the bottom. And it would look like this compared to the one you have in your book in figure L-4. First, you have the socialists on the far left who believe that power should be concentrated in government, political power should be expansive, and these socialists, social democrats, they have a large commitment to egalitarianism, and they want a strong government, high taxes, and they would actually want government to own businesses, set prices. So the prices would be set at the government, not the HEB. Your libertarians, on the other hand, on the far right of the spectrum, would believe in a very minimal power and even get rid of a lot of government agencies. But most of us in this class fall in this area here. Some of you would be more moderate to conservative. Some of you would be more liberal Democrats. Many of you express more of this kind of viewpoint. Some of you would be over here. You would believe in a more socialist form of government. Let me show you a video on that one if I have it here. On the American political ideology. Let's see. This one is kind of interesting about socialism, I think. Let's take a look at this one.
You want American-made masks? We've got American-made masks. These are made in Tennessee.
Commercial.
The wrong side of history. It's one of President Barack Obama's favorite expressions. He's not alone, of course. It's a perennial favorite of liberal politicians and activists. Oppose gay marriage? You're on the wrong side of history. Against pot legalization? You're stuck in the past. It's used a lot in foreign policy, too. In his first inaugural address, for example, President Obama said, quote, "To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history." As Hosni Mubarak's regime in Egypt disintegrated in 2011 and the United States stood by and watched, Obama fell back on the comforting thought that, quote, "history will end up recording that at every juncture, we were on the right side of history." As Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi's chapter on this earth came to an end, President Obama justified American policy in Libya by saying, "I believe that Gaddafi is on the wrong side of history." Speaking more broadly about the then still young Arab Spring, he said, "I think that the region will be watching carefully to make sure we're on the right side of history." When Vladimir Putin started carving up Ukraine, the president insisted that America wouldn't actually do anything about it, but fear not, because Putin is on the wrong side of history. The long moral arc of the universe, another of Obama's favorite phrases, will bend towards justice. In the meantime, tough luck, Ukrainians. You may not have noticed, but the phrase has opposite meanings when used at home and abroad. Domestically, telling someone they're on the wrong side of history means you're going to lose eventually, so why don't you just give up now? But in foreign policy, it means I'm powerless to stop you, but one day, long after I have any responsibility to do anything at all, someone else will say you were wrong. In other words, when used at home, the wrong side of history is a sign of strength. Our activism is vindicated. Things are going our way. But internationally, the phrase is a sign of weakness. You're winning, and I can't or won't stop you. What unites both terms is arrogance. Actually, arrogance and cowardice. The notion that history is moving in an inevitable direction is ancient. But in modern times, its main champion was Karl Marx. Marx argued that socialism was inevitable, according to some scientific principle. Therefore, any objection to its unstoppable triumph was not only morally wrong, but anti-intellectual and even unscientific. This is what the great historian of communism, Robert Conquest, meant when he said that the phrase, the wrong side of history, has a Marxist twang to it. It was the atheist answer to the religious notion that God is on our side, and it led to millions dying as socialists desperately tried to steamroll the future with the wheel of history. The idea has non-Marxist proponents too. There is what the renowned Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield called the Whig school of history, which holds that democracy, though not necessarily socialism, is inevitable. This is a much nicer thought, to be sure, but being nicer doesn't make it any more true. And to be honest, many people have died in service to this idea as well. At home and abroad, for socialists and Democrats alike, the problem is the same. The future is a blank page, and we don't know what will be written on it. But one thing is certain. When people come to believe that they are not masters of their own fate, because history is not on their side, they will be less likely to take their fate into their own hands. Pick your issue. It may well be true that same-sex marriage is here to stay, that Americans will never relinquish their gun rights, or heck, that soccer might actually become America's pastime. But the only way such victories are assured is if those opposing them preemptively surrender based upon some potted assertions that defeat is inevitable. That is what is so undemocratic about the idea that there's a right side to history. It amounts to saying, shut up, to anyone who wants to keep the argument going. Freedom has no meaning if we give over to the idea that we are powerless against the cold, impersonal forces that shape our destiny. In life, but particularly in a democracy, defeat only comes when the losing side accepts defeat. For generations, those on the right side of slavery and civil rights were told they were on the wrong side of history. They proved history wrong by refusing to surrender to it. To paraphrase the English poet T.S. Eliot, there is no such thing as a truly lost cause because there's no such thing as a truly won cause. So long as you are willing to fight for what you believe in, the cause endures. Let history take care of itself. I'm Jonah Goldberg of the American Enterprise Institute for Prager University.
Okay, so he makes kind of broad points about this whole political spectrum. We've got a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, a lot of different values, a lot of different ways of viewing the government. It doesn't mean that if you're liberal, you're bad, or if you're conservative, you're bad, or it doesn't mean if you're a conservative, you're good, or if you're a liberal, you're good. It doesn't mean that. So that's the point he's making here. Democrat or Republican, libertarian or socialist. He recommends express your ideas freely. That's why we have colleges. That's why we have universities. That's why we have a civil society. Although at times it doesn't seem like it because of all the violence in certain areas, rioting and so forth, BLM and shouting down people and so on. That's not traditionally thought of as a value in America. We usually don't recommend it. We don't particularly care for that activity. We believe usually that people should be allowed to express their points of view in a reasonable manner, rational manner. I think that's about it for chapter 1. And so let's see if there's anything else. Social Democrats, I already went into that. I don't know if there's any more videos I could show you that might help you. Let's see if there's any more. Oh, there was one that I thought you might like to see on libertarianism. One of the ones that is talked about in the book. So let me go quickly to that video, and we'll talk about libertarianism, and then we'll finish.
And I think that's the wrong answer.
Oop,
I don't
let me
think
back
that.
up.
In the 19th century, the political philosophy that supported small government and free markets was called liberalism. Unfortunately, between then and now, the enemies of liberalism succeeded in stealing its name, which is why people with similar views nowadays usually call themselves libertarians. The classical liberal, the 19th century liberal position was that the function of government was to do a few things that couldn't be done by individuals on the private market by voluntary association. And those were traditionally listed as police, courts, and national defense.
That's a conservative, actually today, conservative point of view. What was classically liberal in 18, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 was that. That was classic liberalism. what is conservatism today, this is what can get confusing. What's called conservatism today is classical liberalism, that the government's role is to provide order, settle conflicts, provide national defense, just basic government 101, the first couple pages of the chapter. So, okay.
And I got interested, I suppose, when I was in my late teens, in whether you could push the idea of free markets and voluntary association even farther than that. Whether it would be possible to have a society which was organized by private property, trade, voluntary exchange, that set of ideas, but in which there was no government, in which all of the useful things government does, because government does some useful as well as some useless things, were done in other ways. And it's an attractive idea because we have quite a lot of reasons to believe that where the same thing can be done either by government or privately, governments usually do it worse. And government doing things usually involves greater restrictions on individual freedom, because when the government offers you a deal, you don't get to turn it down, whereas when someone in the private market offers you a deal, you do. So it seemed to me interesting to figure out whether you could construct a plausible set of institutions in which the basic police courts defense function were being done privately instead. I started writing about the subject and eventually wrote my first book, Machinery of Freedom, which was published now almost 40 years ago. So how could you have a society in which the fundamental functions were produced privately rather than by government? And let me start with what in some sense is the most fundamental ones, namely making enforcing laws, what we would think of loosely speaking as the job of police and courts. So I want to imagine a society where individuals hire private firms to protect their rights and settle their disputes with other individuals, the same way we hire a private firm to insure us against auto accidents, for example. So I pay some annual sum to one of a variety of different firms, each of which sells the service of making sure as best it can that I don't get robbed or murdered, and that if I have a dispute with somebody else, it gets settled in some reasonable and peaceful way. And there's an obvious problem with that system, one which occurs in 30 seconds or so to everybody who sees it described. And most of them stop after those 30 seconds and they say, well, that's why it won't work, and that finishes it. And the problem is conflict between rights enforcement agencies. So we will imagine that I'm the customer of one rights enforcement agency, you're the customer of another. One day I come home and I find my television set is missing. I call up my rights enforcement agency. I also notice that the door's been broken open. They prudently had installed a little video camera in my living room to try to monitor anybody who stole things from me. And that camera shows a picture of you walking out my door with my television, or at least they're pretty sure it's you. So my agency gets in touch with you and says, would you please give our customer, Mr. Friedman, his television back? And by the way, you owe us $50 for our time and trouble in locating you and recovering his television set. And your reply is, what television set? It's true I have a nice television set, but I bought that from a friend of mine. I've never heard of Mr. Friedman. I've never robbed him. Go away. Well, my agency says, well, if you really feel like that, if you're not willing to discuss this matter in a reasonable fashion, we could send 3 or 4 big tough guys over to your front door tomorrow morning to carry out the television set with or without your permission. And you reply, but if you do that, I too have a rights enforcement agency, and they will send 5 or 6 big tough guys to keep you from taking what I claim is my television set. And so people say, we've set up a situation for a permanently violent society in which my agency and your agency and his agency are always fighting each other over the claims of our customers. And I think that's the wrong answer. I don't think that's at all like.
Well, that would be a criticism by a liberal or a conservative about no government or state of anarchy, so-called. You'd have that situation where you'd have violence. But let's hear him out
To happen.
for a little bit longer.
And the reason it isn't likely to happen is that violence is expensive. That fighting people as a way of settling disputes first gives you very uneven results. There's no guarantee the guy who's in the right will win, though we'd like to believe there is. But more than that, it means people get hurt, they may get killed, houses get smashed. You've got to pay hazard pay to your big tough guys who work for you in some way. There ought to be a better solution. And the obvious better solution in this case is arbitration. So that my agency says to your agency, look, we don't want to get into a fight with you. You don't want to get into a fight with us. How about we go to that private judge over there who's got a good reputation as an honest and competent judge. And we agree that if he says that the television set was stolen from Mr. Friedman, you won't defend your customer when we recover the television set. And if they say that it was not stolen from Mr. Friedman, we will apologize and pay some damages for the hassle we've imposed on him. Now, that's how you might settle it if it came up for the first time. But these agencies, as we imagine them, are going to be in business for a long time. My agency knows that over the next 10 years, it will have clashes like this with your agency 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 times. And therefore, the sensible thing to do is to agree in advance on the court that will settle them. So my agency agrees with your agency that any disputes between the two agencies will be settled by Mr. Smith's private court, which is an arbitrator that has got a good reputation for settling such disputes. Now, it may occur to you to ask the obvious next question, which is who enforces that contract? Because unlike the world that we live in now, there is no government sitting above the agencies compelling them to keep their word. But the answer is that there is a way of enforcing contracts that we're all familiar with that doesn't require a government. And that's what economists sometimes refer to as the discipline of constant dealings. If you and I are going to be interacting for a long time, many times over, each of us knows that if he breaks his word this time, the other one isn't going to trust him next time. That's the end of a profitable relationship. Therefore, it is prudent in that kind of a repeat relationship to try to maintain your reputation by actually doing what you say you're going to do. One of the
Well, we don't have time to listen to it all, but it's a good idea to take a look at this video. It's called The Machinery of Freedom. And this will give you an idea of the extent to which a libertarian kind of philosophy can go to the point of zero power for government. That's a possibility. So that's about it for me. I don't think I have any more. I wanted to just go through that with you. So study the questions at the back of the chapter. That's a good place to start if you want to study for the test. Also, when you're looking at the book, study the key terms at the sides of the books, the columns here, like these terms. Those are a good place to also study for your first quiz, which will be coming up very quickly. So what I'll do is I'll end here, and I'll pick it up with chapter 2 very soon. So thank you for your kind attention.